begin. Thank you, everyone, and hello. Thank you for coming to the final lecture for this semester. May I remind you the session and the following discussion are being recorded, and they will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and Facebook page, where you can already find the recordings of our previous lectures. It is my honor to present Professor Eric Goldberg from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Goldberg specializes in the history of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. His research focuses on the politics and culture of Merovingian, Carolingian, and Anglo-Saxon, the Merovingian, Carolingian, and Anglo-Saxon worlds. His scholarship employs a wide array of sources, such as chronicles, law codes, hagiography, and poetry, as well as artistic and archaeological evidence to illuminate his subject matter and produce a nuanced and detailed image of early medieval societies. Among other awards and honors, Professor Goldberg has been awarded fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council for Learned Societies, the Medieval Academy of America, and the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst. Professor Goldberg's publications include Struggle for Empire, Kingship, and Conflict under Louis the German, 870 to 876, many seminal articles, and recently the book In the Manner of the Franks, Hunting, Kingship, and Masculinity in Early Medieval Europe. Today, Professor Goldberg will talk about Franks, Vikings, and the transformation of Carolingian warfare. We will take questions after the lecture, and if you wish to ask a question, please make sure you send me your name so I don't miss you. And now, without further ado, Professor Goldberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shachar, for that really generous introduction. Shalom, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Shachar, Mor Hajbi, and the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honor to be here, albeit virtually from the frozen state of Vermont. During my talk, I will present some preliminary ideas from a new project I am working on about the Carolingians and the Vikings. And just from the outset, I want to recognize that Vikings, of course, is a modern word unknown to our Frankish chroniclers who use terms like Northmen, Danes, and pagans to describe Norse adventurers in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. I use the term Viking simply as a convenient shorthand to designate the disunited Scandinavian war bands that raided, interacted with, and eventually became part of medieval Europe. Today, I would like to discuss one aspect of my project, which is the impact of the Viking raids on late Carolingian warfare. I hope to show that the Norse raids precipitated important changes in Frankish military organization that created significant and heretofore largely overlooked challenges for late Carolingian rulers. So I begin today in the 880s with the West Frankish king Carloman II. These were dark days for the late Carolingian dynasty, which faced a wave of premature royal deaths, coupled with serious invasions by Norse armies. In the midst of these turmoils, the 18-year-old Carloman II sought to rally the fortunes of the foundering West Frankish kingdom. And what I find particularly striking about Carloman's short reign are the two capitularies he issued in the midst of his struggles against the Northmen. In 883 and 884, he disseminated two capitularies that focused exclusively on the crime of rapina, or violent robbery. As it turned out, Carloman's two capitularies against robbery, or rapina, are the last examples of Carolingian capitulary legislation that survive. Intriguingly, Carloman accused not the pagan Northmen of committing rapina, but rather his very own subjects. In arresting and scripture-infused language, the prologue of his 884 Capitulary of Ver presented the Northmen as God's punishment for widespread plundering of the poor by fellow Christians. And here I quote from the prologue of his capitulary. "We are deeply troubled and angered that the capitularies of our predecessors, especially those decrees against robbery and plundering, rapina et depredatio, are weakened and overthrown by the destructive sins of wicked men. It is no wonder that pagans and foreign peoples conquer us and carry off our worldly goods, since everyone takes by force from his neighbor the things he needs to survive. For it often happens that men march with the army with their bellies full of stolen food. How can we defeat our enemies when our own brother's blood drips from our lips? This behavior cripples the strength of our minds and bodies. God does not listen to our prayers because the cries of the poor, orphans, and widows drowned out our own prayers." So I begin my talk with Carloman II's capitularies because they raise an intriguing question. Why would a late Carolingian king and his counselors, in the midst of serious Viking raids, choose to focus on the crime of rapina committed by fellow Christians? As the prologue of the Capitulary of Ver makes clear, Carolingian thinkers saw the Vikings as God's punishment for the sins of their own people. Curbing sinful behavior, therefore, was a key element of defending the realm against the Northmen. But the question remains why Carloman II and his advisors chose to focus on rapina rather than other crimes frequently mentioned in Carolingian legislation, such as adultery, incest, bribery, and homicide. And Carloman's capitularies were not unique in their concern about violent theft. Rather, they built upon the legislation of his grandfather, Charles the Bald, who had expressed growing anxiety about this very same crime. The few scholars who have commented on the subject of rapina in West Frankish laws have tended to interpret it more as ideological posturing than as practical legislation. Janet Nelson and Fraser McNair, for example, contend that the decrees of Charles the Bald and Carloman II against rapina were directed against lawlessness and public disorder in general, and were primarily intended to present the West Frankish rulers as righteous Christian kings. Jeffrey Kojal has expressed doubt about the effectiveness of West Frankish legislation in general, describing it as, quote, fervent, ideological, and utterly unpragmatic. In this way, these scholars interpret this legislation against theft as primarily ideological in nature and not aimed at any particular new social problems. In my talk today, I would like to propose a different interpretation, that the growing preoccupation with rapina in late Carolingian capitularies was connected to the changing nature of warfare and its widespread impact on society during the 9th century. In particular, I will argue that the growing concern about violent theft in West Frankish legislation reflects the growing challenges late Carolingian rulers faced in confronting foreign invaders within their kingdoms. Primarily Norse raiders, but also invasions led by rival Carolingians. This new situation of warfare within Francia itself required a significant shift in Carolingian military organization from one focused on offensive to defensive warfare. I contend that the growing concern about rapina in the capitularies of Charles the Bald and Carloman II reflected the difficulties these rulers faced in adapting the Frankish military to this new defensive posture. By exploring the connection between rapina and this transformation of the Frankish military, we can gain new perspectives on the complex ways in which the Viking raids impacted politics and society in the late Carolingian era. The Carolingian dynasty came to power through a century of successful military leadership. Beginning with Pippin of Herstal in the late 7th century, Carolingian mayors and kings led the Franks in annual military campaigns against neighboring peoples and slowly transformed the old Merovingian kingdoms into a growing empire. It was these annual raids and conquests that brought in the plunder, the tribute, and the new lands through which the Carolingians won the support of the Frankish magnates and kept them loyal. Timothy Reuter called attention to the slowing of this remarkable century of Carolingian conquest during the second half of Charlemagne's reign. This end of Carolingian military expansion around the year 800 precipitated fundamental changes in political culture, as the epicenter of royal patronage and consensus building moved from the military camp to the palace. In an empire with increasingly static borders, warfare now shifted from profitable territorial expansion to less glorious but still necessary defense of the frontiers. The Norse raids during the 9th century further transformed the nature of Carolingian warfare. The Vikings compelled the Carolingians to deal with opponents not on distant frontiers, but within the very heartlands of the empire. In a series of important studies, Simon Copeland has demonstrated how Charles the Bald and other Carolingian rulers effectively responded to the Vikings through a range of strategies. Not only warfare, but also diplomacy, baptism and commendation, marriage alliances, hiring Vikings as mercenaries, building fortifications, and when all else failed, paying tributes raised from a robust economy. Copeland has uncovered the complexity of Frankish military organization against the Vikings, and he disproves the old notion that Frankish armies were too slow and cumbersome to deal with fast-moving Norse warbands. One key observation Copeland makes is that although the Carolingian rulers did sometimes defeat Scandinavian armies, their victories tended to have little long-term impact. This is because Viking armies were loose confederations of warbands led by ambitious chieftains looking for easy plunder. In the so-called Annals of Saint-Bertin, Hincmar of Rhes, about whom I'll have much more to say later, referred to these smaller Norse warbands as soliditates, or brotherhoods. Hincmar noted how, after being defeated, Viking armies tended to split up into different brotherhoods, move elsewhere, and join with other groups of adventurers. In other words, the Vikings were disunited and opportunistic warbands looking for easy plunder, not a united army bent on territorial conquest. It was this inability to win decisive victories against the Northmen that motivated the late Carolingians to pursue other, more effective strategies, like treaties, baptism and commendation, building fortified bridges, and paying tribute. The most serious threat the late Carolingians faced was not the Viking invaders, who never threatened to seize the throne. The real perils came from Carolingian politics itself. That is, competition among rival Carolingian kings, the uncertainties of royal deaths and dynastic succession, and the shifting loyalties of Frankish aristocratic factions. So building on Copeland's work, I would like to explore how the growing concern about rapina in West Frankish capitularies points to a largely neglected development during the 9th century. That is, growing difficulties in supplying, feeding, and disciplining troops. Although military historians have long studied the complex logistics of pre-modern armies, Carolingianists have tended to neglect this important topic in spite of its wide-ranging implications for our understanding of early medieval politics, society, and economy. I hope to show today that the Viking raids created new challenges for the supplying of Frankish armies, and it was these challenges that precipitated the growing concern about violent theft in late Carolingian legislation. So my talk will basically have three parts. First, I will discuss some aspects of the traditional organization of the military under Charlemagne and Louis the Pious. Next, I will examine the growing concern about rapina in late Carolingian capitularies and what it tells us about the problems of supplying armies against the Vikings. And third, I will consider some additional evidence from Hincmar of Rheims, the influential advisor of Charles the Bald and his descendants. I will conclude with a few thoughts on how a new understanding of rapina in late Carolingian legislation helps us interpret the collapse of Carolingian political hegemony in the momentous year 888. So first, I'll begin with early Carolingian military organization. Building on Merovingian foundations, the Carolingians developed a complex military organization that supported their conquests across Europe. Military historians debate the size of Carolingian armies, offering estimates that range from very small, in the hundreds, to truly massive in the multiple tens of thousands. I find convincing the estimates of Simon Copeland and Guy Halsall, who steer a middle course between these two extremes. Copeland and Halsall argue that the troops of individual counts, bishops, and abbots, the so-called scarae, most likely numbered in the hundreds, while larger royal armies probably amounted to the low to mid thousands and perhaps occasionally reached as many as 10,000. These assessments make sense in terms of the demographics of 9th century Europe, where the population of a large city like Paris seems to have amounted to around 5,000 souls. In other words, a large army consisting of cavalry, infantry, and servants would have resembled an early medieval city on the march. The challenges of feeding such a large mobile population, of course, were considerable. Although chroniclers seldom provide detailed information about the organization of Carolingian armies, the capitularies fortunately do. Capitularies were royal decrees on a wide range of topics issued by Frankish kings, and the Carolingians used them as a chief medium of communication between the court and the nobility. Scholars emphasize the diverse nature of the surviving capitularies in the different ways in which they were composed. Some survive as formal and more or less uniform documents issued by the royal court, while others are idiosyncratic recipient copies in eclectic later collections. These capitularies give us important glimpses into how the early Carolingians organized and supplied their armies. In his well-known Capitulare de Villis, for example, Charlemagne demanded that the steward of each royal estate provide the army with carts carrying around 100 liters of flour and another 100 liters of wine. In the Capitulary of Aachen, dating circa 802, Charlemagne instructed these wagons to carry not only flour and wine, but also bacon and other foodstuffs in abundance, as well as stone cutting tools, whetstones, axes, augers, sling machines, and sling stones. To facilitate the travel of armies, the Capitulary of Aachen directed counts to maintain the bridges in their counties, to have sturdy boats on hand, and to save 2/3 of the fodder for the army's horses. Another important piece of evidence is a surviving letter of Charlemagne's that dates to the spring of 806. This letter, it technically is not a capitulary, is addressed to Charlemagne's cousin Fulrad, the lay abbot of Saint-Quentin. The letter seems to have been based on a formula or form letter, and it suggests the kind of missives that were sent to lay and ecclesiastical magnates during preparations for upcoming summer campaigns. The letter instructs Fulrad to bring his monastery's soldiers fully equipped to the mustering of the army on June 17th. The muster was to take place at Strasfurt in eastern Saxony, 700 kilometers to the east of Saint-Quentin, as you can see here on this map. Each horseman was to have a shield, a lance, a long sword, a short sword, and a bow and quiver of arrows. Moreover, Fulrad was to make sure his soldiers brought food for 3 months following the muster on June 17th and clothing for 6 months. And their wagons were to contain a wide range of equipment and tools in addition to food. The letter concludes by instructing Fulrad to make sure his soldiers behaved peacefully while marching the 700 kilometers to the assembly, and they were forbidden to requisition any supplies from the people except for water, firewood, and hay for their horses. This last detail refers to a decree of Charlemagne's father, Pippin III. In the Aquitanian Capitulary of 768, Pippin announced that soldiers marching to war were permitted to take from the people only hay, water, and firewood. Pippin added that soldiers were allowed to purchase food from the people and that the people were to provide the soldiers with temporary lodging, mansio, in times of inclement weather. Another surviving formula letter, this one from Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious, sheds additional light on the supplying of troops on the march. This formula is addressed to all the bishops, abbots, abbesses, counts, viscounts, hundredsmen, and other fideles in an unnamed region where Louis planned to gather his army. Louis instructed these officials to render to each royal vassal commanding a troop of soldiers the herabanum, that is the army tax, which took the form of daily rations. This formula enumerates these daily rations: 20 loaves of bread, 2 piglets, a pig or a lamb, 2 chickens, 10 eggs, a barrel of wine, salt, herbs, firewood, and 4 barrels of grain and a wagon load of hay for the horses. And it should be emphasized that these were the daily rations, stipendia eorum quotidiae, that local officials were to render to each royal vassal commanding a military contingent. The fact that this list survives in a collection of form letters used by royal scribes again points to the conclusion that the Carolingian court regularly sent out such missives in the springtime, several months before summer armies were to assemble. Such documents underscore the considerable planning required to supply armies on the march and prevent them from requisitioning food from the general population. So I now come to the second part of my talk, which is about the subject of rapina, or violent robbery, in the capitularies and changes in military organization. Beginning in the 830s, Viking raids, as well as the periodic wars among Louis the Pious's successors, put increasing strain on this traditional Carolingian military organization. Facing invading Norse and Frankish armies, late Carolingian rulers had to respond to adversaries not beyond the frontiers, but within the heartlands of Francia itself. A decree of Louis the Pious's son, the West Frankish King Charles the Bald, from the year 847 captures this shift from offensive to defensive warfare. Speaking for himself and his brothers, Charles the Bald decreed, and here I quote, "We desire that every man of ours, in whosoever's kingdom he is located, travel with his lord, cum signore suo, in the army or on any other business. This should be the case unless, heaven forbid, there is an invasion of the kingdom that they call Landwehr, when the entire people of that region should travel together to drive out the invasion." This 847 decree highlights the fact that in cases of Viking raids, there might not be enough time for lords to gather and supervise their soldiers on the march. Instead, everyone who owed military service was to travel as quickly as possible to the assembly. In such cases, kings probably had less time to send out the traditional springtime letters, instructing magnates to collect, stockpile, and render foodstuffs to traveling soldiers several months hence. In other words, the unpredictable attacks of the Northmen and the faster military responses they necessitated created new challenges for the traditional way in which armies were gathered, supervised, and supplied. These obstacles to long-term planning created a potentially disorganized and volatile situation in which more haphazard requisitioning of supplies by traveling soldiers could easily have shaded into intimidation, violence, and theft. The particular nature of the Viking raids exacerbated this problem. Like Carolingian soldiers, Scandinavian warriors and their horses, of course, needed to eat. And they did so by seizing supplies from Frankish estates, farms, and villages. Indeed, much of the Norse plundering we hear about in the Carolingian chronicles simply was their seizing of goods, wheat, livestock, hay, firewood, and the like to sustain their armies. In this way, a strategic competition for food and supplies within the Frankish heartlands lay at the center of the ongoing struggles between the Vikings and the Carolingians. As a result, the common people increasingly found themselves trapped amid rival armies, some Scandinavian and others Frankish, all of which were intent on commandeering their crops and animals. It is in this context that we should situate the growing concern about violent theft in late Carolingian capitularies. Beginning in the 840s, we find growing alarm about rapina, also described as praeda and depredatio in royal decrees. Scholars usually translate rapina in this legislation as theft, plunder, or simply lawlessness, or their equivalents in other languages. For example, pillage or vol in French, or Raub and Einbruch in German. However, close examination of the capitularies reveals that these references to rapina, praeda, and depredatio refer primarily to a particular kind of violent theft, that is the unlawful requisitioning of supplies by soldiers. And this has, in fact, been observed by Elizabeth Magnu-Nortier and Geoffrey Kojal in their important studies of the peace of God. Magnu-Nortier and Kojal have shown how this late Carolingian legislation against rapina foreshadowed the peace of God councils of the 10th and 11th centuries and their decrees against the plundering of the church and of the poor. And this is, I think, a really significant observation. But what I want to do today is to consider this late Carolingian legislation not as a pre-echo of the peace of God, but rather in its own 9th century context. Legislation against violent theft, of course, long predated the Viking raids. According to Roman law, rapina was the theft of movable goods committed with violence, and it retained this fundamental definition throughout the early Middle Ages. The Roman penalty for rapina was fourfold: return of the stolen item or payment of its value, plus an additional threefold compensation. The Lex Salica likewise imposed a high penalty for violent theft, demanding the return of the stolen item or its value, plus a fine of 30 solidi. Charlemagne and Louis the Pious occasionally addressed rapina in their capitularies. Notably, their decrees explicitly associated this crime with soldiers breaking the peace while on the march. For example, one decree of Charlemagne's reads as follows, and I quote, "If someone in the army beyond the royal command robs or steals crops or grain, or grazes or destroys them with horses, let him pay threefold the estimated damages according to the law. If it is a free man who does this, let him also be compelled to pay for it the royal bannum, that is 60 solidi. But if he is a slave, let him remain in that place as a slave in triple payment of the penalty according to his law, and let him also suffer the penalty of corporeal punishment." Charlemagne's decree against rapina makes clear that the central issue was the illegal requisitioning of supplies by soldiers. The decree states that soldiers in the army, as well as their servants, should not seize crops or grain from the people super bannum dominicum, beyond the royal command. Once again, this seems to refer back to Pippin's 768 decree that troops in military service were permitted to take from the people only hay for horses, water, and firewood, as well as temporary housing in bad weather. While Charlemagne and Louis the Pious brought up the crime of rapina only occasionally, it becomes a central preoccupation of Charles the Bald's numerous capitularies. There's not enough time today to discuss all of Charles the Bald's decrees against theft, but I will give two examples, both dating to the 850s. The Capitulary of Survey of 853 and the Capitulary of Quierzy of 857. During these years, Charles faced multiple Norse armies along the Seine, Somme, and Loire rivers. In the 853 Capitulary of Survey, Charles and his magnates legislated against what they saw as an epidemic of robbery by soldiers and their oppression of the poor. The Survey Capitulary enumerated the crimes perpetrated by the king's vassals and Franki homines, that is, Frankish soldiers, while on the march. Rapina, as well as brigandage, plundering, unjust military exactions called Hereszupf, and damage caused by the pasturing of horses. The 853 Survey Capitulary concluded with the text of an oath to be sworn by all Franki homines not to commit robbery and to report the identity of any known raptores to the king's missi and counts. Charles the Bald issued his most detailed capitulary against rapina 4 years later in 857 at Quierzy. Once again, Charles faced multiple Norse armies that had recently sacked the cities of Paris, Tours, and Blois. Addressed to all his bishops, missi, and counts, Charles opened the Quierzy capitulary with these words, and here I quote, "Your faithfulness should know that according to holy authority, we gathered a synod of venerable bishops and an assembly of our faithful men on February 14th at Quierzy. We discussed matters of benefit to the church and the pressing business of the kingdom, especially how robbery and plundering, rapinae et depopulationes, might somehow be overcome and banished with God's help. For robbery and plundering are spreading, grassantur, in part because of invading pagans, but in part because of the mobilization, mobilitas, within our kingdom of some of our faithful men, indeed committed by those very same men who ought to defend and protect God's church and ensure the stability and peace of the realm. The capitulary goes on to describe the kinds of rapina committed by traveling soldiers. They included the seizure of crops, produce, hay, grain, and livestock, breaking into or burning homes, and damaging fields with their horses. The king emphasized that a lord was answerable for his soldiers' behavior, and that the lord would be stripped of his office if he did not punish theft and other breaches of the peace committed by his troops. The king's missi, counts, and bishops were instructed to investigate and punish the perpetrators of rapina, and local priests were to send them written reports identifying robbers within their parishes. Charles imposed heavy penalties on those convicted of this crime: triple compensation for the stolen goods, payment of the 60 solidi bannum, penance, as well as the public humiliation of carrying one's saddle on his back in the king's presence. This last detail, the penalty of harmskara, or carrying one's saddle, is significant. It underscores that this legislation was aimed primarily at robbery committed by wealthier mounted soldiers, that is, noblemen serving in the cavalry, rather than by commoners who were less likely to be able to afford a war horse. When we look at Charles the Bald's extensive legislation against rapina, and many other examples could be given, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that he and his advisors were really troubled by this crime committed by traveling soldiers and that they wanted to correct it. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain why Charles's capitularies offered such detailed instructions for the investigation and prosecution of those who committed theft. Nevertheless, there is evidence that Charles the Bald was torn between his desire to protect his subjects from unjust requisitions and the pressing need to supply his troops. Here, a key witness is Hincmar of Rheims, who is the subject of the third and final section of my talk. Until his death in the year 882, Archbishop Hincmar of Rheims was one of the most powerful prelates in the West Frankish kingdom, and he was an influential advisor of Charles the Bald and his successors. Beginning in the 860s, Hincmar was the author of the most important West Frankish chronicle, the so-called Annals of Saint-Bertin, and he played a hand in composing some of Charles's capitularies we have been examining. Hincmar also was a zealous defender of his church's property, and he was concerned about unjust exactions and robbery committed by the soldiers of the great lords and of the king himself. Hincmar voiced these concerns in a remarkable collection of 3 letters. This collection of Hincmar's letters survives in a 9th century Paris manuscript, BN 13764, and they can be precisely dated to early February 859. At that moment, Charles the Bald's chief concern was not the Vikings, although several Norse armies were still at large in his kingdom, but rather the recent invasion of his rival brother, Louis the German. Only weeks earlier, Charles had managed to drive Louis the German out of West Francia and thereby avert this attempted coup. In early February 859, Charles was hurrying with his army to meet his nephew Lothar II at Charleville. and to present a unified front against the East Frankish king. Charleville was located within Hincmar's diocese, and the archbishop dreaded the arrival of the king's army. As we have seen, bishops were obliged to supply royal troops with food and supplies, the herabanum, when they were passing through their districts. But in spite of Charles's many decrees against rapina, Hincmar feared that these requisitions would get out of hand and lead to widespread lawlessness. Hincmar addressed the first of these three letters to all the priests in his diocese. His letter contained the text of a sermon, an admonitio, that every priest was to read aloud to the king's soldiers traveling through his parish. The sermon admonished these itinerant troops to abstain from robbery, fornication, and other unnamed crimes. And it warned them that the recent invasion by pagan Vikings, as well as by Mali Christiani, that is Louis the German and his East Frankish army, were caused by the soldiers' own sinful behavior. The sermon closed with the demand that those who had committed rapina make immediate confession and perform penance or face excommunication. Hincmar addressed his second letter to all the clergy at the palace serving the king, queen, and their faithful men. Hincmar unleashed harsh words at the court clergy, accusing them of turning a blind eye to the robbery and plundering that their men were committing in Hincmar's diocese. After a great deal of scriptural pyrotechnics, he concluded with both the carrot and the stick. Those palace clerics who prevented their men from plundering would be preferred by Hincmar when church offices became vacant. However, the court clergy who did nothing to curb their men would face excommunication. Hincmar sent the third letter to Charles the Bald himself. The archbishop commenced by criticizing the rapina committed by Charles's court and faithful men in the regions through which they traveled. He informed the king that he had sent a sermon to his parish priests that they would read to the king's homines caballarii, that is, his mounted soldiers, whom the archbishop characterized as coquillones, gangsters and hustlers. Hincmar sent along a copy of his sermon against robbery to Charles, and he urged the king to have it read aloud to the fideles in his entourage. Hincmar admonished the king not to keep so many men at court, since they lived as parasites off the labor of others instead of from their own estates. Instead, the king should travel with fewer, more upright men who would take only the fodder and supplies due them, peacefully and without theft. The archbishop concluded the letter by raising three disturbing rumors he had recently heard. First, that Charles the Bald had said that he did not want to get involved in any accusations of theft against his men. Second, that the king refused to hear appeals to his court from victims of theft. And third, that his men, after receiving the due provisions from Hincmar's properties, extorted from them an additional payment, which Hincmar criticized as a redemptio, or a shakedown. Hincmar hoped that the first two rumors were false, yet he lamented that he knew from reliable sources that the allegations of illegal shakedowns committed by the king's men were true. Hincmar's writings uncover the double bind that a late Carolingian king like Charles the Bald found himself in. They were concerned, Charles the Bald was concerned about the rising problem of rapina, but at the same time, he had to feed his court and troops when marching against invaders, both Norse war bands as well as rival Carolingians. The fact that Charles the Bald's grandson, Carloman II, was still legislating against rapina in the 880s suggests that the late Carolingians never found a satisfactory solution to this serious challenge. So I now come to my conclusion. Feeding armies, of course, was always a serious challenge for early medieval rulers, and military exactions could easily shade into theft, extortion, and violence. Nevertheless, the evidence I have examined today points to the conclusion that this problem was becoming more acute during the Viking raids of the 9th century. Several factors made raising supplies for Frankish armies increasingly difficult. Less time to prepare for campaigns against invaders, the breakdown of the traditional framework for provisioning and disciplining armies, the seizure of foodstuffs by Viking war bands, as well as the simple fact that late Carolingian kingdoms were much smaller than the former United Empire. This context explains the growing preoccupation with rapina in the legislation of Charles the Bald and Carloman II. But there was a limit to what kings could do, since they needed to feed their soldiers and could not afford to offend the magnates who led their armies. And here I reach my final point. The growing protests against unjust military requisitions most likely contributed to the collapse of Carolingian hegemony in the momentous year 888. The Carolingians could deal with the Vikings through a range of strategies, but widespread rapina committed by Carolingian kings and their fideles and soldiers helped undermine, to use the words of Stuart Airlie, the dynasty's longstanding specialness and magic aura. One of the things that enabled people to buy into the Carolingians' authority and specialness for so long had been the dynasty's ability to keep relative peace within the empire, even if that peace was bought at the expense of much warfare beyond the frontiers. But the late Carolingians' inability to prevent Viking war bands, Frankish armies, and the royal court itself from plundering the properties of the church and people helped convince some prelates to abandon the dynasty and crown new leaders when Charles the Fat died without direct heir in 888. One of those new leaders was Count Odo, the hero of the Viking siege of Paris, whom the West Franks now chose as their king. Significantly, Odo's surviving coronation oath opens with a vow to the West Frankish bishops not to allow what the last Carolingians had permitted. It begins with the words, and here I quote, "I promise and pledge to every one of you and to the churches granted to you that I will preserve canonical privilege, do law and justice, and provide defense against the robbers and oppressors of your churches and their properties, as is my sacred duty, as far as God grants me the ability to do so." Whether King Odo kept his promise, however, is the topic for another day. Thank you for your attention, and I now welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Goldberg, for this illuminating talk. I would like to open the floor for questions. Anyone wants to start? Otherwise, I'll use my privilege. Yes, Rick. You are muted. Rick, you are still muted. There.
Pardon the ignorance of someone who works mostly earlier and with poetic and linguistic texts, but With regard to the attitude you were arguing against in the beginning, do historians know about some kind of purely ideological decree that is totally unrelated to practical problems faced by the authorities? What would a paradigm case of a purely ideological decree look like? I can't imagine one.
Well, I don't know if I would say that any decrees were purely ideological, but Carolingian scholars debate the extent to which legislation was practical and sort of aimed at reforming practices and institutions, or was more important as an articulation of royal ideology. I can't think of anything that was purely ideological, and I think most scholars would say that both were always important. That ideology as well as practical, the legislation had a practical significance as well as ideological.
So the ideology itself was a practical necessity in some cases.
Yeah, certainly the ideology was extremely important, and that's kind of a main point that Stuart Airley makes in his recent book. It's a wonderful book about the making and unmaking of the Carolingians, and sort of just kind of reminding us that the Carolingians had to work really hard to be special, and that after it stopped working after a while, or became less effective after a while. So ideology, ruling by the grace of God, that's not something that just happens. It's something that you really have to work very hard at to convince people that this is in fact the case. So ideology is something that's constantly being actively shaped and debated.
Thanks very much for the explanation. Great talk.
No, thank you.
Next, we have Jeff Kajal.
Hi, Shahar. Nice seeing you again. And hi, Eric. I've got so many questions, but I'll save most of them. I will ask my most nagging question. The question has nagged me for quite some time. Do you know? Do you have an idea yourself, or have you read anyone? And maybe, in fact, Simon, I think, is on here. Would know, or Rosamund, who wrote Ver? Because the way I've described it is it's like a capitulary version of Ephesians. Which is like supposed to be Paul, but it's not Paul, but it sounds like Paul. Ver sounds exactly like Hinkmar, but it can't be by Hinkmar.
Right.
And that means that there is somebody who is close to Louis the Stammerer's court, who has very similar opinions and is using the exact same kinds of texts. I've puzzled over this for years. I've asked friends, colleagues about it, and I have not found a good answer. So do you have an idea?
It's a great question. It's funny. There's actually, I forgot who said this, but someone said that Hinkmar wrote it, but of course that's impossible.
That's me.
Oh, okay. My theory is that it's Goslin of Saint-Denis, because he had recently also been appointed the Bishop of Paris, a key position, and so was someone close to the king and the royal court, obviously. So that's my hunch, is that it's Goslin. One interesting thing is, if you look at the first decree of the Capitulary of Ver, it's a clear echo of the De Ordine Palatii, which is dedicated to Carloman II. So
yes.
That one decree is I think a clear echo of the De Ordine Palatii, but everything else after that, it focuses on, as you know, rapina, and this problem of lawlessness in the parishes. So I don't think we know, but my hunch is it's Goslin. It's almost certainly not Carloman II. Although he grew up around Charles the Bald's court, so he would have had a pretty great education for a Frankish nobleman, and probably the best education available, at that time. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Daniel Mileno.
Hey, Eric, that was really interesting. Thanks so much. I was wondering, obviously you focused on West Francia here there are some pretty good reasons to do that, given sort of just the sheer magnitude of Norse incursions on West Francia in the 9th century. But I'm wondering, have you come across any of this sort of similar concern about rapina in the other areas, whether it's Lotharingia or in the sort of East Frankish context? Or is this fundamentally a concern of West Frankish rulers due to a specific sort of the magnitude of Viking behavior, despite the fact that there are Viking raids in other kingdoms? Clearly it is more a West Frankish problem.
Yeah, it's a good question. As I mentioned, it does come up, well, in the capitularies of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, it comes up occasionally, but surprisingly seldom. After Louis the Pious, most of the capitularies we have are West Frankish. You know, there are those capitularies from the joint meetings of Carolingians, and there's always a West Frankish ruler present, and they issue these joint decrees, and some of those mention rapina, but it's mostly West Frankish capitularies. You know, as you know, we don't have really East Frankish capitularies. We don't really have Lotharingian capitularies independent of these royal meetings of multiple rulers. I will say one thing I need to spend more time looking at are the church councils, and I think the church councils, I wouldn't be surprised if this topic comes up a lot in the church council. So that's going to be the next step of sources that I look at.
Great, thank you.
Now we have Jenny Davis.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the talk, Eric. The first thing I wanted to ask was, I think, related to Daniel's question that you just answered, but a little bit more specifically about the capitulary evidence, which of course I understand why you're using it, but I'm wondering how much the sort of rhetorical expectations of the capitulary genre itself kind of shaped what you're seeing there. And then the sort of, my second question is, you know, it seems like part of what you're doing here is trying to rethink our broader narratives of the Carolingian Empire and this whole question of, you know, 888 and the end of the dynasty and that loss of its sort of exclusive control. And I guess I just was sort of interested then in how you sort of see that framing, because, you know, that whole idea of military decline is something that we would see in some of the older literature, just with a little bit of an earlier dating, you know, the whole sort of Charlemagne creates the empire and Louis the Pious destroys it. So just wondering a little bit about how you sort of see your own sort of reworking of that broader periodization and narrative there.
Thank you. Let me see if I understand the first question about the capitularies and rhetoric.
Yeah, just you know, that the whole thing about rapina, absolutely sure, I take your point that it's reflecting concerns about what's going on, but some of what gets in the capitularies, and particularly what gets repeated in capitularies, is sometimes of ways in which legal discourses are being continued that is not solely a matter of reflection on outside circumstances, right? So that, like, if you particularly if you repeat, you know, some of what Charlemagne says, some of what Louis says, and then once you have Ansegeissus, the citation of Ansegeissus changes the way the capitularies refer to earlier capitularies. So I'm just wondering if there is an element here in the capitularies as a very specific source genre with a set of concerns and a language that shapes your evidence, if that clarifies.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Ansegeissus's collection really has a huge influence on Charles the Bald's legislation. It becomes sort of the handbook of the capitularies of our ancestors. So that's a really good point. But Ansegeissus, you know, he does not focus on rapina. particularly. It's a subject that does appear occasionally in one section dealing with military issues. And so I guess get back to the question, why would Charles the Bald and Carloman II focus on this one crime? Because like if you read the Admonitio Generalis or Louis the Pious's capitularies, I mean, they deal with a wide range of topics. And it seems funny if this is kind of an issue of rhetoric, why this one crime? Why does this one crime become the main focus? Why not focus on, fornication or, homicide or feuds or, I don't know. I mean, and so it just, I'm just really struck that this in the midst of what becomes a pretty, serious situation with Viking raids, especially with the arrival of the so-called Great Army from England in 879. Why in the midst of what's becoming a real crisis for the West Frankish rulers, why are they focused on robbery of Christians on Christians, as opposed to other types of crime, right? Abduction of women, for example, incest. There's a lot of greatest hits of Carolingian sins, and it's strange that they focus on this one. And so I'm trying to answer that problem. And I think you're right that Ansgar Geises's collection really does influence Charles the Bald's legislation, as well as Pseudo Isidore. But they don't just focus on this one topic. So I'm hoping that's a part of an answer to your question. And 888 in military decline. I tried to make the point that actually, and this is a point that Copeland makes, that the Carolingians could deal with the Vikings. The Vikings were not the main problem they had to deal with. What the main problem they had to deal with was Carolingian politics, right? Rival Carolingians, the problems of dynastic succession, keeping the nobles loyal. But what I think this issue of rapina or military requisitions does is it undermines the authority of the dynasty. So I wouldn't say it's military decline, but I think there becomes a crisis of authority because these military requisitions are becoming more and more common, because kings year after year in smaller kingdoms are mustering the army, and this necessitates military requisitions within Francia itself. And that was not the way it usually had worked. When Charlemagne sent out his armies off to, the marches of Bavaria, there were letters sent out, there were stockpiles of supplies along the lines of travel. We know that Charlemagne had ships going along the Danube bringing food to feed his troops, and they committed a lot of violence and destruction, but that was beyond the frontiers, fighting against the Avars or the Bohemians. So I don't think it's military decline. And Simon Copeland shows that that's not the case, but I think there's a crisis of authority because of these requisitions, and which is becoming, I argue, is becoming more acute during the 9th century.
Warren Brown, please.
Hi, Eric. It's really good to see you. And,
Hi, Warren.
I appreciate the talk. It was fascinating. I just want to ask you if you can position yourself. I'm taking a step from what Jenny just said and asking if you could position yourself a little more clearly against the older historiography. And what's particularly intriguing me, whenever these questions come up, particularly questions of logistics and supply, the first people I think of are the father and son Backracs. They were out in front first. Whatever you might think of their tendency towards maximalism and Romanism, their work is very careful and you have to take it seriously. And I'm just wondering what they had to say about this. I'm unfamiliar with what they've said about this particular period. Have they said anything about changing logistics in the later 9th century, the ability of the Carolingians logistically to deal with the Vikings. How does what you're doing fit against what they've done? Because like I said, I generally associate these kind of discussions with them.
That's a good question. Bachrach Senior focuses mostly on Charlotte, sort of early Carolingian. So his Prelude to Empire book, you're right, has a lot to do with logistics, and his work on Charlemagne's military also obviously is focused on Charlemagne, and there is a lot about logistics there. David Bachrach's work deals a lot with sort of the Ottonians and sort of the German military, and dealing with logistics there. So this is kind of, the 9th century has kind of fallen between the cracks, as it were, in these studies. So unless they have publications that I don't know about, I haven't really seen somebody working carefully with the later Carolingians and especially the capitulary evidence.
Well, the only thing I'm familiar with is Bernard's very early article on early knighthood, where he at least cracks the door on this, but I didn't know whether they'd done anything since.
But that article, he does talk about Arnulf and the battle of the river, is it Dial, with where they get off their horses and walk on foot, but he's not talking about logistics there. Right. He's just talking about cavalry. But he does have really important things to say about how much grain and hay horses need, how much urine and excrement they produce per day, what happens in terms of disease if you don't deal with this. So you have to have a lot of shovels. He really talks about that generally, but not in terms of the 9th century.
Okay, thank you.
Josh Timmerman, please.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting, terrific paper. I know you mentioned that you haven't yet looked much at the church councils from this era, but I'm wondering if from the text that you have looked at, you've seen much in terms of patristic ideas about rapina. I'm thinking in particular, as I was listening to your paper, of what Augustine has to say in City of God, Book 1, Chapter 30, where he's discussing opposition to the Third Punic War, and he notes that the excessive destruction of Carthage gave way to civil wars, which resulted in cruel prescription and plunder, prescriptionem et rapinarum. And he mentions then that Romans didn't just have to fear their enemies, but then far worse, they had to fear their fellow Romans because they never knew if they were going to be victims of prescription and plunder. And I'm just wondering if something like this, like a patristic passage, like this one from the City of God, factored in at all to this sort of ideology or to this particular late Carolingian conception of rapina. Thanks.
Oh, that's a great question. So that was Book 1, Chapter 30. No Carolingian legislation that I've seen, whether capitularies or church councils, mentions that particular passage, and it sounds like a really great one, and one wonders why they don't bring it up. I haven't systematically gone through the footnotes of the Concilia, so it's possible that I've missed a reference, but I've never seen that particular passage mentioned. So I will have to read that passage again, which I haven't done for a while, and then do some searches. But I haven't seen any church councils bring that one up. Most of the it's mostly scriptural passages that come up. Isaiah comes up a lot, and some of the letters of Paul come up a lot, where he's talking about raptores, and it's mostly scriptural references that come up in for example, Hincmar for the Capitulary of Survey, I think he writes a sermon against raptores, and almost all of his references in that are scriptural, and a lot of Isaiah that comes up.
I will just let you know that I've looked at annotated manuscripts of City of God from the later 9th century, and this particular passage often scribes are noting this. I don't know how much this would overlap with the military context, but there is Carolingian, later Carolingian interest in this particular passage from Book 1 of the City of God. If these notes by mostly monastic scribes are any indication of interest. Thanks.
Thank you.
More Hajbi?
Yes, I just wanted to add to Josh's question because that was my exact question. It's very similar to late patristic writing, not only Augustine, but Salvian and Quod Wildeus. They all frame robbery as a sin and other sins as well, to explain the state of the kingdom or the state of affairs. And I was wondering specifically regarding the first quote that you showed, and again, Hincmar's first sermon, whether they add the dangers of what would happen if the state of, like, if people won't stop committing robbery. So is there, I mean, the patristics, they always, I mean, they show you the danger of not complying with God's commands. And I was wondering if they do the same thing.
Yeah, Hincmar, for example, is super explicit that raptores will not achieve the kingdom of God. If he knows who they are, he's going to excommunicate them if they're members of his diocese. If they're from a different diocese, he's going to tell the bishops to excommunicate, the local bishop to excommunicate those people. And he says explicitly, prayers for the dead will not benefit them if they have been raptores. So that so they are beyond the reach of prayers for their souls.
Right. Sorry, perhaps I wasn't being clear. I wasn't talking about the specific individuals who committed a sin, but the empire. I mean, the political entity. What would happen to the political entity if sinners living in?
Yeah, I mean, the refrain again is what we saw in that first quote, and this is something that Hincmar also brings up, is that God is punishing the Franks for robbery, and that is why the pagans and the Mali Christiani are invading the kingdom, and so it is it's a replay of biblical history, right, where the Israelites are punished for their sins by foreign invaders. And that's why Isaiah is so powerful. The book of Kings and Chronicles comes up, and sort of, the Vikings are the new Babylonians who are punishing the new Israel for their sins, or punishing the Franks for their sins. It's interesting that you mentioned Salvian, and who was the other author, because they're living in an empire in a time of invasion, right? Sort of the fourth and fifth century, and this is, and there I see some parallels between that period and the later 9th century, where you have, another empire dealing with these foreign invaders,
And if I'm not mistaken, the early manuscript of Salvian's De Gubernatione Dei was written in Paris. So.
Great.
I do have a question as well. I'm thinking about Laurie Sarti's chapter in the very recent companion to the Merovingian world. She writes there about the Merovingian military, and in what she writes, it seems that these robberies of local populations were a normal part of Merovingian warfare. to the extent that the population seems completely accustomed to it. And in some cases, when the military is too weak, they just tell them, oh, you're too weak, your problem. And I wonder if two things actually, if the Merovingian sources, to your knowledge, use the same wording to describe these rapinas or these situations, and also if you think that it reflects a change in the perception of the Frankish rulers with regard to their obligation or their part in protecting their own population.
That's an interesting question. Well, I have to begin by saying I haven't read Laurie Sarti's chapter in the companion to the Merovingian world, which I should do. But I have read her book about war and violence in late antiquity or something. Anyway, her first book. The Merovingian legislation actually doesn't talk very much about rapina. I mean, as I mentioned, it appears in the Lex Salica, but it is not a common refrain of their legislation. One scholar I mentioned is Elizabeth Magnu Nortier, and she tries to make the argument that actually nothing really changes with the peace of God decrees, and that this is a constant refrain that goes all the way back to the Merovingian period. But I was looking at her footnotes in the Merovingian sources she refers to. When I actually went to those texts, they don't actually seem to be talking about the same thing that these Carolingian decrees are talking about. So for whatever reason, and I'm not really sure why, it doesn't seem like it's a major preoccupation of the Merovingian legislation, which is not to say that there wasn't a lot of violence committed by armies. I'm sure there was, but for some reason it's not something they're talking about in the legislation. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Obviously, I'll maybe caveat by saying this was actually the topic of your talk, the difference between the two situations, right? The Norse raids obviously offer an explanation to this difference, but I wonder if it also reflects a sort of change in the perception of the ruler's job, right, to protect their own people from the army or from. Yeah,
I mean, certainly, I mean, Paul Kershaw wrote about this in his book about the Rex, the peaceful king, right? About the hugely important role of peace in Carolingian ideology. I mean, it's not exclusive to the Carolingians, of course, and this goes back to Augustus in the first century. It's part of the Carolingian, it's part of Charlemagne's title, right? That he's a peaceful king. So, I think it is important for the Carolingians. And I do think that, one of the things that's different about the Carolingians from the Merovingians is the Merovingians had a lot of civil wars. Mm-hmm. Until, the 830s, the Carolingians were really good at focusing those wars on their neighbors and then beyond their frontiers, that they're directing it outward. And that, I think, creates a pretty remarkable period for several generations of peace within Francia itself. Again, this changes in the 830s and 840s, both with the civil wars and with the invasions of the Northmen. And then obviously there's other invasions, Muslim armies, Magyar armies later. There is in the second half of the 9th century, people living in the Frankish kingdoms were experiencing war directly in a way that they hadn't for several generations before that. And I think that's the big shift.
Yeah, thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I will ask you to join me in thanking Professor Goldberg once more for this very wonderful talk. And we will, we will soon announce the program for the next semester and upload our recording to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much and have a pleasant vacation if you have a vacation, and strong health to everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate your comments today, and it's a real honor to be here.
Thank you.